Hello everyone, I'm Jonathan Little for PokerNews.com, and today we're going to be going through another hand from a $3,500 buy-in tournament that I took 35th place in recently at Borgata. And in this scenario, folds around to me in the cutoff with King, Queen of Clubs. I raise it up to 6,000, and the big blind, a kid with only 30 big blinds, elects to call. Some people think, oh, this is an all-in or fold spot, but no. That would be a very big mistake. I know some players have gotten a hold of reshove charts recently, and they think that my only options are to go all in or fold, and that could not be farther from the truth. The big blind in this scenario should actually be calling a pretty big chunk of the time, opting to go all in, well, not all that often. So if you're using reshove charts and you're blindly following them, stop immediately, especially from the big blind, small blind, button, cutoff, well, really every position. The reshove charts are just not all that useful because calling is an option. Don't forget that you're allowed to call. It's highly important for you not to forget that. All right, flop comes Jack 4-2. Opponent checks. I'm definitely going to be betting this very uncoordinated flop with most of my range, perhaps all of my range, for a small bet size. So my opponent checks, and I bet 5,000. You want to use small bet sizes on uncoordinated boards just because if you are ahead pre-flop on average, which I will be, because I'm only raising my decently strong hands where the opponent should be calling with all sorts of stuff, I'm usually going to be ahead on most flops, so you don't mind just making a small bet and going from there. If the opponent did raise huge in this spot, guess I would fold. I don't really want to fold this hand because we have two overcards and backdoor flush draw. But if you do happen to get raised huge, it's probably just okay to fold. If you get raised small, though, you need to stick around. Again, don't forget, you are allowed to raise small in this scenario. The opponent could very easily make it 12,000 with a lot of hands and put me in a pretty bad spot. I know a lot of recreational players would just fold out hands like King, Queen of Clubs, Queen, 10 of Clubs, etc. if they faced any raise. And against a small raise, that would be way too tight. You're allowed to stick around, even with a relatively shallow stack, especially when you're getting great odds, right? All right, turn is the 5 of Clubs, giving me a draw. And the opponent now checks again. So now we have to decide, should we keep betting? And here you want to ask, what does the opponent's range look like? Well, the opponent could easily have a jack, of course, which if I bet the turn, I could get jammed on some portion of the time, which would not be especially great. My opponent's range should also contain a lot of underpairs, which would be put in a pretty bad spot if I bet, and they'd almost never raise me because I could just easily have a jack or an overpair, right? So that's nice. Our opponent could have a lot of 4s or 2s, like King 4, King 2, Queen 4, Queen 2, etc., etc. And those hands are going to be in a pretty bad spot. So you see, the only real time that I am going to face a difficult decision is when I bet the turn and get jammed. And that should not happen all that often because I can just have all the good hands in my range, right? So this is a spot where I think I can get away with betting pretty big. Pot's 26,000. I really only want to be betting here with my best hands and my draws. And I think it's fine to bet something like 15,000 or 20,000 in this spot. That's going to put my opponent in a bad scenario with most of his range because he probably has a whole lot of marginal made hands. And that's going to allow me to probably bluff on the river. If I had a hand like ace high flush draw, I would be more inclined to check that one behind because that has a little bit of showdown value, at least a little bit more than king high, right? So this is a spot where I think it's okay just to keep betting. I do bet 15,000, opponent calls, and river, well, we kind of get there. So now the pot is 56,000, and our opponent has 54,000 behind. And we have to decide, should we be going for value here? And I definitely think we should. We have the best hand almost every time, and we can get called by worse, right? If the opponent happened to have a jack, he could certainly call the river. If the opponent has even a hand like pocket eights, he may decide to hero call thinking that this is a good bluff card for me. This is a spot where when I'm playing against a kid, a young person, I am pretty inclined to use a big size, even though I am going for marginally thin value, because a lot of players will look at this board and say, all right, all the ace highs bricked, meaning they have nothing, and they may feel somewhat inclined to bluff. The only hands we're really losing to that would want to bet big on the river is a random queen or a flop nut hand like a set, and those are all clearly somewhat unlikely because which queens am I just blasting with on the turn? It's got to be exactly ace, queen, king, queen, queen 10, queen 9 of clubs. Would those even jam the river? Some people don't. So as you see, if the opponent is a thinking player, he's starting to find that I don't actually have a whole lot of nut hands to bet here besides queen, jack, pocket 4s, pocket 2s, and pocket 5s, right? So That means that if my opponent thinks I have relatively few nut hands, and there are clearly a whole lot of bluffs I could have, any ace high, king high, etc., I want to use a big bet size. So I like an all-in. Sometimes, though, in tournaments, you may find that your opponent will not call an all-in unless they have a really good hand. I don't think that's the case against a young person. Young people realize, in general, that people are loose and aggressive and they battle for pots. But if your opponent is the type of player who will just fold out a jack every time to an all-in, then certainly bet smaller, like 30,000. But against a young person, I'm going to be a little bit more inclined just to go for the all-in. So that is what I do this time, and my opponent folded. So a bit of a bummer that I didn't get paid. Realize, though, that if your bet size options are either 54,000 or, let's say, 25,000, you need that 25,000 bet to get called 2 times as often to have the same equity as a big bet, which is great. Now, obviously, whenever you bet smaller, you're going to get raised sometimes, and then you get to fold. You don't really want to fold to a raise, but that happens sometimes. Obviously, if I am beat when I have the king queen and I go all in, I just pay off every time because I'm already all in. So every once in a while, you get off the hook a little bit for a small bet. So that's a little bit of value in that. You may also induce a bluff, though. So make sure you're not just blindly folding every single time you bet 25,000 or so. Anyway, what it amounts to is that when you use big bet sizes, they don't actually have to get called all that often to show a substantial profit, even more so than a small bet. Some people would bet like 10,000 on the river thinking, all right, I'm just really trying to get called. Realize your bet needs to get called 5 times as often as a big bet. It's hard to get called 5 times as often as a big bet when you use a small bet. Maybe you'll get called 2 or 3 or 4 times as often, but 5 times is tough, which often means going for that big bet is ideal. You may say that, like, don't I value just getting a few extra chips? I mean, not really. I value making the most money possible. And yes, that increases variance. Sometimes you just find spots like this where you don't get much value throughout the tournament and it doesn't work out. But other times you jam here and you get called every time by worse hands and then you just have all the chips. And getting all the chips is highly, highly important in a poker tournament because that is how you win. Also, a nice thing about betting all in is that your opponents don't get to see your cards unless you're foolish enough to make a video for pokernews.com and share it with everyone. But that's okay. I don't mind. So yeah, I jammed all in, the opponent folded, and we moved on to the next hand. So that's going to be it for today. I hope you enjoyed this hand from the World Poker Tour event. We'll continue going through a few more hands next time. Thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you later.